I'm glad to be here again. Let me get my PowerPoint started. This week, in my homeroom, there's really just one student who's been coming every day since we reopened the classroom. And for 2 days, he had a runny nose and he was coughing a little bit and a sore throat. And you know what happens when people see someone like that around them? Maybe he's got COVID. Can you ask him? So I told him, I said, maybe you should go and see the doctor and double check. Now, that morning, before he went to see the doctor, he was one of those students that was randomly picked to do an ATK test at the school, and the test showed negative. I told him, anyway, go and see the doctor. He went and saw the doctor. I like his doctor. I think I need to get to know that doctor. So the doctor examined him and so on. And he said, oh, it's not a big deal. You just have the common cold. Everybody's afraid of something when it might be something else. And then the doctor told him something that many of us, I think, have forgotten. He said, there are still other diseases. COVID is not the only disease around. And so he came back the next day. I said, what did the doctor say? He related to me what the doctor said. And, he had a much happier face. He said, sir, I don't have COVID. The doctor says, I just have common cold. We live in a climate of fear right now. There was a caption on the Bangkok Post yesterday that the sudden spike of numbers has spooked the government in Thailand. And I'm like, wow, today it went up again by another 1,000 or something, okay? More and more, some people are saying, well, let's just learn to live with it like we did with a common cold and so on, but others are so afraid. And one kid in a room gets sick and they're like, oh, let's all run and do a ATK or PCR or whatever test. We almost expect the worst. Do you recall the story of Jesus and the disciples? They were in this boat and there was a huge storm on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus was fast asleep in the middle of the storm. The disciples were full of anguish. We are going to die. We are going to die, and then they see Jesus sleeping and they are disturbed. How can you sleep when we are about to die? Lord, what's wrong with you? So they wake him up. Don't you care? We're about to die. I can almost imagine Jesus, like, have you ever been woken in the middle of the night and you're really fast asleep and you're like, why do you wake me for? And so he commands the winds to stop. Never mind that part. But I like what he said to the disciples. He said, why are you afraid? Where is your faith? That little response from Jesus tells us that you cannot have both occupy the same space. If you have faith, you cannot be afraid. If you are afraid, you do not have faith. There's so many Christians who are afraid. So they walk around, they wear double masks and so on because I might get COVID, But we cannot live by fear. One of my colleagues in the school made this statement when they were talking about this sudden spike of cases. And she said, oh, I'm tired of even thinking about it. I just want to be happy. I don't want to be afraid anymore. But for Adventists, the thing that frightens us even more is not a pandemic, it's not a tsunami, it's not some earthquake, it's the end of the world. Anytime somebody gets up in front of the pulpit or on a TV screen or on YouTube or whatever and tells you about the end of the world and how this is being fulfilled, that prophecy is being fulfilled, and before you know it, you're like, oh, I might be lost. I am so amazed that the people who are supposed to understand the Bible the most and therefore should have the best version of faith are sometimes so easily disturbed. Without living in difficult circumstances, say like Tonga or some other place, or Afghanistan or wherever. And so let's examine this sermon of Jesus. We will only look at the first 2 paragraphs of the sermon. Scholars call this the apocalyptic sermon of Jesus. It stretches all the way to the end of chapter 25. But for the sake of today's study, we will look at the first part of the sermon, the one we are somewhat familiar with. What led Jesus to give some of the answers he provides here are two questions that the disciples asked him. What is the sign of your return? What is the sign of the end of the world? Now, which one of us in this service today, in this worship today, looking at the screen, has never at some point in our life stopped to ask those questions? With the pandemic ruling our lives right now, lots of people are asking that question. Is this a sign of the end? Is this the sign Jesus is returning? The threat of war that we see hanging over Ukraine right now, I'm sure that Adventists in Ukraine are asking that question. Is this a sign of the end? I can still recall when the first Iraq war, Gulf War started. I was still working in Singapore. And the first Sabbath after the war was declared and the American forces invaded Kuwait and then Iraq, members would walk up to me, Pastor Fanwar, do you think this is a sign of the end of the world, a sign that Jesus is returning? And so Jesus gives them in these two paragraphs 4 signs. The first sign he gave is not what they were thinking. The first sign he gave them is the sign of deceivers. He says, many will come in my name, and they will tell you I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many. You know, we've all become experts at reading the symptoms of COVID-19. So let's use that analogy. What is the first sign that this pandemic has hit us? Jesus doesn't talk about wars as the first sign, or about natural disasters as the first sign, or about the abomination of something as the first sign. No, the first sign is deceivers. He says, many will come in my name. Now, even in the book of Acts, we discover very early people who were trying to do things like perform miracles, preach in the name of Jesus. Those of you who are Netflix people, I'm sure that by now you have watched that series entitled The Messiah. How easy it is for people to be enticed by somebody who comes out there and he's got wonderful things to say. But I'd like to tell you that this deceiver sign is not just something out there in the world. It's not just worrying about the various happenings in the world, the various people who are on YouTube or on television or whatever. But it is a sign, more importantly, that may exist right within our own ranks, within the church. There are so many different kinds of preachers within Adventism. There are lots of them who are saying all kinds of things, even though what they say cannot be fully corroborated by some biblical or scriptural item. If they are charismatic and they are persuasive, they will find an audience. You know, during the 1990s, we were all familiar with the name Waco, Texas, the Branch Davidian. What was amazing about that whole movement and that whole tragedy is that the bulk of the followers of David Koresh happened to be educated Seventh-day Adventists who are so anxious for the return of Jesus, for the end of the world, like the disciples. When is it going to happen? Is it tomorrow? Is it now? Is COVID-19 a sign of that they're easily deceived? I like to think of this as the gullibility of faith. We have so much faith in the fulfillment of prophecies that it opens the door for Satan to pull the wool over our eyes and make us afraid. I would like to suggest that the deception Jesus is talking about here is not necessarily the deception of truth. Because this term Messiah was not strictly reserved for Jesus. It was used in scripture for any deliverer that God sent. So the judges in the period of Judges were a kind of Messiah. Cyrus, who permitted the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem, he was called a Messiah. And so the term is a little bit fluid. By the New Testament times, it became attached to Jesus through the Greek name Christos. But what is behind the name is more important. Throughout the history, prior to Jesus appearing, during his lifetime, and even after, there were constantly people coming out trying to persuade everyone that they have got the right version of truth. I would like to suggest that one way to decipher a deceiver is that they seem so convinced that only they know the truth. That's why I am the Messiah. I am the Christ. I am the Messiah. If you listen to me, if you hear what I say, this is the truth. You and I are also learning a lot about vaccines, so I'm going to use that language. So the first symptom of the end of the world, as Jesus put it, is deceivers. Here's the catch. Throughout Christian history, this has been a reality. It's not something special for the end of the world. It's a generic sign. Just like having a sore throat is a generic sign. It could be COVID-19, it could be just a common cold. And so we need a vaccine, or the first shot of vaccine. And Jesus provides it here in verse 4. Watch out that no one deceives you. What is Jesus trying to say? Remember, he's talking to his disciples. This is not an open-ended sermon to all his audience. This was specifically targeting his disciples based on the questions that they had asked him. And these were the same men who cried, "Save us, we're about to die," in that boat on the sea. Basically, Jesus is saying that what they need to watch out for are not the things that frighten them, but how to grow and increase their faith. Because when you have genuine faith in God, you're not so easily deceived. You're not so gullible. If your faith is shaken because of something somebody said, then your faith is not real. The disciples' faith was shaken because they were afraid. Their boat was shaken by the storm, never realizing that the safest place to be was actually in that boat, no matter how heavily it was being tossed back and forth by the winds. So, help, we are sinking. The moment fear kicks in, deception can also kick in. So Jesus says, watch out that no one deceives you. There is a certain common sense about faith. If God has promised over and over and over that he will protect his people, that he will watch over his people, that when they are in the darkest valley of their lives, whether that is a result of his soon coming or it's a result of some personal crisis, he will be right there with them and protect them from whatever outcome they may face. Faith tells us it's not a big deal. Okay, another crisis. Okay, another pandemic. It's not a big deal. I have faith. I know my God. I know what he will do. I do not want, as my colleague said, I do not want to live in fear. But a believer has to go beyond that. I choose not to live in fear. If you are disturbed, if your faith gets shaken like that boat because of some wind, whether the wind is somebody's preaching or some YouTube video that you watched, or some reading that you did, or some whisper in your ear about the end of the world, if that happens to you, examine yourself. Where is your faith? As Jesus asked those disciples, you must ask yourself. I must ask myself, where is my faith? Where is your faith at that moment? So take this vaccine shot. Watch out. Exercise some common sense. Is this frightening me? Then it's not from God. Is this increasing my faith? Then it is from God. Jesus moves to the second sign. Christians have been very fond of this sign and yet never paid attention to what Jesus actually says. The second sign is the war sign. He says, you are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. There's a big rumor of war right now hanging over Ukraine. And America and NATO have been constantly sending out messages that Russia is about to invade the Ukraine and all these things will happen. And if they do that, if Russia does that, the West is not going to stand by, and everybody is now painting Third World War scenarios. This is real, but it's also generic. What is new about this? When has this world ever existed without experiencing war? When has this world ever gone through a complete period of peace when there was no conflict anywhere? Many of us may not be aware, but if you're Indian, you need to be aware there's always a potential for war, and it's broken out into border conflict between China and India. There's always a potential for war between Ukraine and Russia that will draw other people in. There's always a potential for war between North and South Korea. There's always a potential for war between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. This is everywhere. It exists. And sometimes living in a country that hasn't really known war for many centuries, like Thailand, can create an illusion of peace and security. No such thing exists. Some wars are civil in nature, some wars are international in nature, some wars are just tribal, some wars are international in that they may involve just 2 nations or 3 nations, or maybe a lot of nations. I'm sure that the people who lived during the Second World War would have thought the same way. Is this the end? Is this a fulfillment of this sign? And if that should come in your mind and you fail to recognize that this is a generic sign, it's like one of those signs that could apply to the common cold or to COVID at the same time, then you need to understand the faith vaccine that Jesus provides. And here's what he says: see that you are not alarmed. See that you are not afraid, because this is not the end. This is not the end. And so the early Christians thought Jesus was coming back when they began to see the crumbling of the Roman Empire being attacked by all those so-called barbarians from Northern Europe and Asia and everywhere. Surely this is the end. And so they thought Jesus was coming back. It didn't happen. When the First World War, the war to end all wars, started, I'm sure that Christians all over the Western Hemisphere thought this is the end. When the Second World War came, they thought this is the end. Now we fear a Third World War with this Russia-Ukraine standoff. And I'm sure many are thinking this is the end, but Jesus says wars are never the end. Wars are just a symptom. Wars are just a sign. Notice the language of Jesus, not just wars, but rumors of wars. I think we should add here some of the things that we experience at a lower level, not nations actually fighting, but protest movements that are violent, civil disobedience that leads to the loss of life or to some form of destruction of property. But those things have always been there, and those things will always be there. And knowing that this is not the end is just a sign. So you have a runny nose, you have a sore throat. It could be COVID, but it could be just a common cold. Jesus is being deliberately nebulous. They want to know when. Give us the sign. And he said, okay, here's the sign. And I'm sure if you were Peter and John sitting on that little hillside and listening to Jesus, you're scratching your head. What does that mean? Does that mean it's happening or it's not happening? Should we take it seriously or should we not? But Jesus doesn't stop there. He gives them a third sign. And this is kind of a biggie, because he says this: nations will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. This is what I call man-made disasters. Look at some of the cities in the world, in Syria, in Afghanistan, that have been under civil war. There is a rumor of war in the Balkans right now. And the people of Bosnia who are still recovering from that last civil war are already scratching their head and praying that another civil war doesn't break out. Some of those cities have not been fully rebuilt. There are areas of the Galilee, if you travel today, where they still have the minefields from the Yom Kippur War. And so they have signs for you not to miss your path. But Jesus adds something else here. Besides nation against nation, he says there will be famine and earthquakes in various places, natural disasters. I would like to suggest that Jesus is talking here about climate change. This is the big factor as he approaches the end. Now, some of the older manuscripts actually have another word in this listing. Besides famines and earthquakes, they have the word epidemics, or maybe we should add pandemic. So if you were to ask me, is COVID-19 pandemic a sign of the end of the world? Most likely, quite probably. But then so is the Tonga volcanic eruption. Do you know what it's like to be an entire nation cut off from the rest of the world because the communication cable is broken and your entire country is covered in mud and slush and ash from the volcanic eruption and the subsequent tsunami? You and I don't know what it means to have. And for them, I'm sure, being a Christian nation, a lot of Tongans may have been praying these past few days for the world to really end, so Jesus will come back, so they don't have to go through the very painful process of recovering this little country of Tonga. And yet, Jesus provides another vaccine. He says all these events are just the beginning of birth pains. They're not the actual birth. They're just those first contractions when the mother is on the verge of giving birth. And you know that that can happen over an extended period of time before anything really happens. So it's quite possible we will have another pandemic besides COVID-19 that might be worse than COVID-19 before Jesus comes. The Christians in the Middle Ages had to live through the Spanish flu, the Black Plague. They all wished for the end of the world at that moment. And perhaps some of us are doing the same right now. But then Jesus says, take the vaccine and you will realize, again, this is not the end. It's just the beginning of birth pains. It does mean that maybe the end is getting closer, but it's not here yet. Nothing to panic. No need for us to run off to some secret place to hide. None of that will actually work when Jesus returns. And that brings us to perhaps the real intention of Jesus' discourse. You see, Christ is not so concerned about these natural things or man-made things. They're all part of that generic picture of the end of the world. His real concern is here. The fourth sign is a combination of stuff. And he says to them that they will hand you over for persecution. They will kill you. You will be hated by all the nations because of my name. They will take offense at you and betray one another and hate each other. The bigger sign that the coming of Jesus is really almost upon us is persecution by the world against God's people and betrayal among God's people. Now, I don't know. Do you see this happening? Can you honestly say this is what's going on in our churches right now? I'm not so sure. God's Spirit is still working. But there's the other side to this. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. Lawlessness will multiply and the love of many will grow cold. The rise of false prophecy and the rise of inhumanity. You know, as we get more educated, more technologically advanced, we are also becoming less humane. less humane. Think about that accident that took place in Bangkok recently. A policeman riding a fancy Ducati motorcycle knocks down a little doctor pedestrian, literally knocking her off her feet, flying in the air, kills her on the spot, and somebody has the inhumanity to stop and take a video picture of it. And this is happening everywhere. People would rather take a video picture and go viral than stop to offer a helping hand. You know, the very technology that we are using in lieu of work, in lieu of thought, in lieu of studies, is becoming the technology that is making us less and less humane. You know, Jesus, in another place, says, another place in this sermon would say that as it was in the days of Noah, that's how it will be in the days when the Son of Man comes. People are often caught up in the religious movements of the world or the political movements of the world and say, oh, this is the fulfillment of that sign. Jesus is more concerned about the days of Noah. Now, what was special about the days of Noah? If you read carefully about the days of Noah and why they are a perfect analogy for the end of the world, first of all, is that the days of Noah resulted, after a long holding period, in actual destruction of the whole world. Same thing will happen in the final analysis of history. But there are two primary sins of Noah's generation. The havoc they were playing on the planet, failing the very first mandate that God gave Adam and Eve, and the inhumanity of the human race, the evil, the crime, the perversion that took place. What Jesus is saying is this, that the real sign we should be looking for is this one. This is what will lead even church members to betray each other, where the world will persecute people simply because they have faith in God, where people will make lots of money because there are gullible people who will believe anything they say. I read an article recently that kind of turned my stomach and made me feel a little bit sick. During the 2 years of the pandemic, the 10 richest families on our planet doubled their wealth in 2 years. At our expense, when the world is in suffering, people losing jobs, losing income, being stuck in their homes for month after month after month, these 10 families doubled their wealth. Probably one of those families is the one from whom you're buying all the ATKs or all the masks that you are wearing, that I'm wearing. They doubled their wealth because of that. I read another article just this week analyzing why AstraZeneca vaccine has kind of taken a backseat to Pfizer and Moderna. And the analysis blew my mind. You see, the creators of AstraZeneca and the company that's selling it decided that they will sell that vaccine only at cost. So minimal profit for them. It's one of the cheaper vaccines. It is fairly cheap to transmit around, doesn't require extremely low temperatures. So why is everybody running after Pfizer and Moderna? Is it because they're better vaccines? And here's the kicker. Both of those vaccines cost about 5 times what Astra and Zeneca are charging. And the countries who are making Pfizer and Moderna readily available are willing to pay that bigger bucks because there is something happening between them and those pharmaceutical companies. So the company that makes Pfizer, that make Moderna, in Thailand, you can't even get free Moderna. You have to actually pay for it. Pfizer is not free either. The government is paying for it. And so as a result, those two are being pushed in the front. Why? They cost a lot more, nearly 5 times what Astra costs, but because everybody thinks that they will get a better product or it's a better PR in the process. And I'm like, what kind of a world are we living in? Why doesn't Pfizer and Moderna and all the other vaccine companies follow the example of Astra and make the vaccine available at cost so that more people in the world can have them. You see, if you ask me what are the more important signs of the coming of Jesus, it's these days of Noah signs, the inhumanity, the loss of love in the world, the persecution, betrayals that are happening. And by the way, if you think there's no persecution against the Church of God, it just depends where you live. And so Jesus says that the love of many will grow cold. Humans will be more concerned about making money, even if it is at the suffering of humanity. But there's a vaccine even for this. Jesus says the one who endures to the end will be delivered. The one who endures to the end will be delivered. Noah and his family had to endure an extra 120 some years of betrayal and persecution and being made fun of, being the butt of all the jokes in the world and the inhumanity they watched. God's people may have to do the very same thing. The world is not going to get better, neither is the church. And in that nexus is where we can read the signs most clearly. And that nexus of problems between the world and the church requires endurance on our part. Now, many of us have taken 2 shots of the vaccine or even the third one, the booster shot. And yet there are people around the world who are still catching COVID-19. It's special Omicron variants, even after doing that. It's almost like there's no real escape. And yet, recognizing that because you have that vaccination and your body is starting to build serious antibodies against coronavirus, that you are still better protected. I read another study that was released in the UK that people who are fully vaccinated and yet still catch the virus, whether it's that way or a different order, they have the best protection against any coronavirus variant in the future that exists. You see, Jesus is saying that you are going to witness these things happen, and you're going to have to endure. You're going to have to endure the inhumanity in the world. You're going to have to endure the false, what we call fake news and misinformation that we have. You're going to have to endure outright persecution or betrayal. This is the fourth and his primary sign that Jesus gave his disciples at the end of this paragraph. And he caps this in verse 14 by saying, this gospel will go into all the world. Under these conditions, it will go to all the world. The entire world heard the message of Noah. The entire Roman world had heard the message of those persecuted early Christians. The world will hear God's message in our generation as well. And so Jesus basically is saying that you and I must learn to live by faith. That faith vaccination offers us the best spiritual protection. And so it doesn't matter what's happening. It doesn't matter what games the devil is playing or the nations of the world. It doesn't matter what is going on around us, what pandemic hit or what war arises or what natural disasters befall upon us. Those things will not frighten us. They will rock the boat, but like Jesus, we can live with faith. I think what I would rather hear Christ say to me is, you have faith, well done. I don't think I want to hear him say, like he did to the disciples, why are you afraid? Where is your faith? Jesus never, ever told his disciples they had no faith. He had 2 phrases that he would use on the disciples often. One is, why is your faith so little, so small? The other, which is more common, is, where is your faith? Almost suggesting that faith is like a misplaced vaccine. When I went to pick up my vaccine passport from the Ministry of Public Health, they discovered that the hospital that had given the Astra shots to me had misplaced the label. And so they had entered the wrong batch number on my first vaccine. And man, I was so worried. I was like, do I have to take That first one again, they said, your number is wrong. I said, I have no explanation. I don't know what happened. And then a very kind lady at the ministry said, don't worry, we will take care of it. We will track this down. They called up the hospital. It took them 30 minutes to find the right number. I had the vaccine, but it was misplaced in a manner of speaking, and so could not be corroborated or confirmed. You see, it's not the science that his disciples needed, but the faith. It is not the knowledge of what's going to happen at the end of the world, but the vaccination that comes by having faith, so that it does not matter what happens, we will still live with a sense of equilibrium, a sense of shalom, knowing that God is protecting us. And so I say to you today, read the sermon of Jesus, read the rest of it. He keeps doing this at intervals, giving us these little excerpts about faith and how they can keep us steady, even if the boat seems to be rocking around. We don't lose our head. We don't displace our faith. We do not replace it with fear. If you are afraid, ask yourself, where is my faith? If you have faith, fear has no room in your life. If we are able to do that, then we will be able to rest, knowing that God is looking after us. And no matter what happens, no matter what pandemic hits, no matter what political, military, financial difficulties strike our world, climate change, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, pandemics, market crashes, none of these things will faze God's people, because we can walk with our heads held high and our hearts in tune and say we know who we believe in. And he has got the boat under control. The safest place is where Jesus is. The safest place is in that boat. So live by faith, not by fear, even as we attempt to understand the last days of Earth's history. Let faith be our guiding light, not fear. That's what God would have us do. That's what I hope that we will make a part of our everyday life. Not just faith when you are in church, but faith at the market, faith at the workplace, faith in your home. I wish you a very good Sabbath, and may faith abide in your homes and in this congregation. God bless. Shalom.